Vancouver, Washington, where we are, is on the traditional lands of the Cowlitz people. Thank you to the historical caretakers of the land, both here, across all North America, and beyond. As we gather today, I ask that we remember so many of our friends, families, neighbors, the earth, and all of her denizens, people, land, and animals suffering around the world. In my mind, at this moment, are Afghanistan, Palestine, Israel, Sudan. All are facing violence, devastation, and the suffering of hundreds and thousands of people, while the land itself faces upheaval and disruption from earthquakes, bombs, and climate disaster. Lastly, before we begin, let us acknowledge these last 3 years and the grief we carry from so many sources. We cannot rush ahead, pretend we are well, and expect a different future. This is part of our collective work to not shy away from our grief or deny its existence. These opportunities, when we are together, even if it is virtually and if it is in person, they are a gift, a place to share our pain and fears in balance with moments of joy and release. Access to education is a human right. As educators, we have been given the honor, the responsibility for crafting educational paths that are accessible to all people. This is our gift and our purpose. Expanding access to education makes us better at our craft in how we think and feel about ourselves, our colleagues, and our students. All the ways we make education both available and accessible strengthens us as learners. It enjoins us to more complex and innovative approaches to growth as humans. It deepens our capacity for care and to end cycles of educational trauma and harm. We are complex, curious, and adaptive beings, capable of incredible generosity and courage. Even more should that describe us as educators. In a time when we witness constraints and barriers being erected and fortified at every turn, we are called to remove barriers, tear down gates, and widen pathways. Accessibility encompasses the devices and methods and structures that we do or don't use, and it reaches further. It is a way of feeling and being, of believing in the promise of education and learning. It is holding the certainty that everyone deserves access to education, and our responsibility as educators is to do and be everything we can to ensure that access. Learning and our ability to learn is foundational to our existence as a species. How we learn, integrate knowledge, and relate to the world informs and shapes our existence, regardless of formal structures and systems. Embracing accessibility brings us to both the content and purpose of education. Formalized education and its systems are useful in many ways, but access to education only begins in those structures. We also want to build strong, capable, confident learners and strengthen our own ability to learn, adapt, change, and engage with complexity. Embracing accessibility brings us to both the content and purpose of education. Formalized education and its systems are useful in many ways, but denying people access to education is harm, made worse through our own disinterest or ignorance. In these ways, we also dehumanize ourselves, denying the rich variety of pathways and openings into learning, protecting the gates that protect our comfort and that feel familiar. Educational trauma can undermine our confidence in our ability to learn, but trauma is deceptive. It doesn't actually stop us from learning, but it keeps our ability to learn confined to survival, limiting our belief in and access to the range of gifts and skills and tools that we have for visioning and creating different futures. Every time someone integrates knowledge, our futures are graced with the potential for newness, for discovery, for creation. Our work as teachers is to hold space for that emergence, to connect it with our shared realities. Author and scientist Dr. Keltner talks about the eighth wonder of life as epiphanies. He says, epiphanies unite facts, beliefs, values, intuitions, and images into a new system of understanding. While we may not think or speak directly about epiphanies, learning and integrating that knowledge, then making choices based on what we've learned is how we become our fullest selves and create lives that we enjoy living. But this process is predicated on us believing in ourselves as learners, having confidence in our ability to learn, change, and grow. All unresolved trauma has some impact on the brain, how we think, how we consider, how we react. And those effects can linger across our lifetimes. Educational trauma may have an outsized impact because it can compromise our ability to learn. Limiting ourselves as educators to only what we know, afraid to venture into unfamiliar terrain, is one way we perpetuate cycles of educational trauma and harm. We obey these self-imposed limitations because we too have been subject to learning-related harm, and our own ghosts and scars accompany us into our classrooms. But these painful remnants are not permanent. We have the capacity to look into our own hearts, examine our experiences, and reflect on how satisfied we are with ourselves, with our practice. We have the chance to make new choices grounded in new understanding. These prompts are for us to explore how educational trauma impacts teaching and learning, and how we begin building trust in ourselves, each other, and our students. If you'd like, you can pause the recording and take some time to reflect on these questions, or just take them with you and think about them throughout your day. We'll pause for a moment and come back. Educational gatekeeping has brought us to this point, creating narrower and narrower openings into the pathways of education. Systemic racism and ableism are two of the most powerful gatekeeping weapons in our arsenal. And I use the words of war with intention, as we often fight to maintain our privilege and against our students' right to education, for their right to learn in the ways that they need and want to learn. When we are asked to extend ourselves, we remain motionless, frozen by anxiety and apathy, paralyzed by perfectionism, terrified we won't be up to the task. We forget that we are also learners, refusing the challenge to engage in more complex and innovative ways. We refuse to acknowledge, to feel the harm we do to ourselves and to others. Because trauma is such a huge umbrella, let's refine our understanding and look specifically at what kind of harm we are discussing. Trauma changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. It disrupts our ability to make meaning, to build connections with other people, to situate events on a timeline, and engage critical thinking, reasoning, and long-term visioning. Educational trauma, defined as the emotional and spiritual wounds inflicted during the process of learning by Dr. Leanne Gray, as students are shamed for how they learn, is almost certain to embed itself at our very core. This harm often translates into, you are a bad person because you cannot learn in this specific way or to this particular standard, regardless of your needs as a learner. And it becomes a moral judgment on who we are. It can erode confidence in our ability to learn and grow and change, cause us to believe that we are bad people if we cannot learn in certain rigidly defined ways. One of its most devastating impacts is that people become convinced that they are unable to learn, and they lose confidence in themselves as strong and capable learners. If on a deep and unconscious level, we have been conditioned to believe that we cannot learn, that how we learn is wrong, that we are somehow fundamentally wrong, why would we continue to try? People will do almost anything to avoid feeling shame, and that includes shame around learning. So why keep trying something that so often makes us feel ashamed? Accessibility is about expanding those openings, inviting and welcoming all people to engage learning on their own terms, not ours, interrupting the internal monologue of disbelief. But if education is to have a future, it must be expansive, and accessibility is about all the ways we take down the gates to learning to leave behind our role as gatekeepers. Our past and our present do not have to be our future. We all have the ability to learn and grow and transform. We are all capable of change and of changing the world around us. It is easy to underestimate the power of being differently, of bringing a more whole and compassionate self into learning spaces. It is easy to forget that people always remember how they were treated, whether that was with dignity and care or scorn and cruelty. How we are treated and how we treat others is where education and learning live and breathe. Trauma responsivity is a through line, a common denominator, a thread that weaves together the intersections of oppression. It understands and feels current and past hurts, is committed to ending educational harm. Although intellectual understanding and acknowledgement is necessary, it is incomplete until we remember and honor the grief and pain we all hold in our own hearts and bodies. It is incomplete until we rediscover the well of courage that exists deep within each of us. Trauma responsiveness at its core is about harm reduction. It is about meeting people where they are, meeting our own selves with gentleness, with an invitation to extend trust. It holds us all in our common humanity and our shared desire for liberation and joy. Understanding how trauma generally can impact learning is necessary, and building a practice that works to counter those impacts is desirable. But where we can make a more direct effort is understanding how educational harm happens and committing to ending that cycle of trauma in our classrooms. I believe the crucial first step in educational harm reduction is rebuilding trust in the self, in others, in education and learning. When people are harmed during learning, they lose confidence in themselves, as well as in the process and the act of learning and in their teachers. This mistrust continues until and unless we prove ourselves trustworthy, and that means also trusting ourselves. Our own capacity for trust may have been abused during education, but we are now learning that we can rebuild that trust in our own hearts and minds and bodies. Relearning for ourselves gives us insight into how we bring our personal sense of renewed trust into learning spaces. This is a second set of prompts you can use to talk about what it means to rebuild trust for yourself in your educational institutions, in teachers, with your colleagues, in your life. As with the other set of prompts, you're welcome to pause the video and rejoin us when you're finished, or take them with you and talk with them or think about them on your own. Access to education matters in content exploration, in learning how to learn, in discovering our capacities as learners, and practicing how to relate to others, to see ourselves and them as equally human, equally worthy, and deserving of love and care. Schools are where we learn to dehumanize ourselves and others in public. We learn who gets to do harm and who must endure harm. If we are lucky, we begin to unlearn our own dehumanization at some point in our lives. That unlearning is the first step in rehumanizing others. I hope that those of us listening today are lucky that we are learning that reclaiming our own humanity is part of rehumanization for everyone. What I have heard time and time again is that classrooms are a place where some people felt recognized in their humanness, even if for a limited time and in limited ways. How and why this happens, who experiences it and who doesn't, why some classrooms don't offer humanity and others do is a long and complicated conversation, but I can offer a piece of insight for all of us who work in teaching and learning spaces. We have to remind ourselves that we are human first before we can truly recognize anyone else's humanity. Embracing ourselves then opens the space for us to treat others with the dignity they deserve as full and complete human beings. While it is not our place to confer humanity, we can protect and care for ourselves and others by remembering our shared birthright, our shared worthiness. We are all worthy. We are all born enough. Education, schools, which should be places that affirm our worth, treat us with dignity, and strengthen us as learning beings, instead undermine our sense of worthiness, trivialize our dignity, and sow the seeds of disbelief into our learning selves. Systemic racism and ableism are embedded in all parts of the system of education. They dehumanize everyone they touch, replenishing and nourishing nothing. Maintaining our humanity, remembering the humanity of others, is not a given, and it takes more than the application of our intellect. It demands work, consideration, thoughtfulness, and above all, the desire to want to maintain and embrace humanity. It requires our imagination, our hearts, and that well of courage that we may have neglected. What changes when we approach accessibility not as a requirement, but a gift to our craft? When we delight as educators in finding ways to tear down the gates and throw ourselves into the joy of education as liberation. When we revel in the joy of our students and through them celebrate our own growth. And here again, education and learning can provide a way forward, a path that takes us into a future where joy and wonder lead us into the fullest version of ourselves, building a world that affirms life and care and generosity and awe. We hold the gifts and talents and creativity to imagine joy in teaching and learning, how they feel, how they sound, how they look and taste and smell, how they make us feel, even in the darkest of moments. We have to believe how they will fundamentally shift our experience as humans toward the fuller expressions of our loving and generous natures. This imagining happens on the individual, collective, systemic, and cultural level simultaneously. Even the smallest, tiniest effort can have exponential impacts because that's how joy works. It is highly contagious. All we need is a taste of what it can be in order to give ourselves over to its birth. And we aren't imagining alone. There is an emerging consciousness, a collective that is working together toward joy in this life, on this planet, in this existence. Joy in so many different iterations and forms. We have to keep choosing joy, wonder, imagination, and care. Keep asking the questions that matter most when it feels the hardest. How do we prioritize dignity and compassion? How do we fight for our liberation and not our privilege? Maybe that's what we can do right now when things feel grim and so dark, is to keep choosing joy, keep choosing to believe that we can and are better, keep practicing hope and joy as a discipline. Every time we choose these directions, we affirm ourselves as beings who can be more than violent survivalists. Dr. Keltner, who I mentioned earlier, also writes about collective effervescence, one of the 8 wonders of life, originally introduced by Emil Durkheim. Durkheim describes the experience of collective effervescence as feeling like we are buzzing and crackling with some life force that merges people into a collective self, a tribe, an oceanic we. Remembering, even imagining this joyful physical sensation, that we can find it together, can help in even the bleakest of moments. In all my years of education, as both a teacher and a learner, the teachers I remember best are those who so thoroughly enjoyed learning with us that it was impossible not to want to join them. Even when times are hard, we can find joy and satisfaction in teaching, and we can share that joy with our students. Sharing the joy of learning together is the future that pulls me in its direction, and I hope to meet you there in those splendid fields.